Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. This is video number 11, proper number. If I've kind of gone back and tried to get the proper number for my review in response to Joel Richardson in his book, Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery. Somehow or other, due to the loss of my lights and the moving and what have you, I believe I lost the proper number. I believe this is properly number 11. And I'm not going to continue this very much longer. I think I've pretty effectively demonstrated that Mr. Richardson's hermeneutic in this book is simply flawed. He engages in presuppositional logic. He imposes on the text modern events, modern identities of people, which changes up who the Bible was talking about. Now, in the last video, which is number 11, but is number 10, I pointed out that in the prophecies of Jeremiah 25, Ezekiel 25 and 35, we have the predictions of the destruction of Ammon and Moab and a host of other countries, 25 other countries as a matter of fact. And what Mr. Richardson does, he is to say, well, those nations, those countries, those kingdoms will be destroyed at the coming of the Lord. The trouble of it is, we are specifically told that those kingdoms, for instance Edom, would be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. They would be destroyed for piling on, as it were, when Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem in BC 586. The Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, all of them failed and refused to come to the aid of Israel. The texts are clear, okay? The texts are clear that their destruction was coming because of their failure and refusal to help Jerusalem at that time. Nowhere does it indicate that those kingdoms were to be judged 2,500, 3,000 years later for what they did 3,000 years before. That's what I mean when I say Mr. Richardson is guilty of an anachronistic hermeneutic. He rips things out of their historical context, the times that it specifically tells us, and the people who are specifically named, Nebuchadnezzar, who would bring about that day of the Lord. Not 3,000 years later, Nebuchadnezzar, as Yahweh said, in Ezekiel 29 and 30, I have put my sword in the hand of the king of Babylon. So when Nebuchadnezzar was carrying out his campaigns against Ammon, Moab, Edom, and the other 25 or so nations, he was acting as God's agent. It was God acting through him. That's why it's called the Day of the Lord. Okay, I want to move on now to a tremendously critical point. On pages, let me see here, pages 111 and following, Mr. Richardson seeks to identify Babylon as the Islamic Caliphate and Mecca. And he examines the fact that Revelation 17, Revelation 18 talks about Babylon as a queen of kings, talks about her as a great economic influence, talks about her dressed in the royal garments of the purple and the gold and the silver, etc., etc. And what Mr. Richardson does here is he uses the terminology of Revelation chapter 17 and 18, all the while ignoring actually the prophetic application of the terminology. Here's what I mean by that. He admits that Babylon was guilty of spiritual adultery. That's the very term that he uses on page 115. Here's where Mr. Richardson completely ignores the biblical, the prophetic use of that term. You see, Babylon is referred to as a harlot. And over and over and over, the book of Revelation draws from the language of the Old Testament prophets, from Ezekiel, from Hosea, from Jeremiah, from Isaiah, as he refers to Babylon as the harlot. Now, here's what you really, really have to catch the power of, folks. In those prophetic books, the word harlot is used 91 times. 86 out of those 91 times, that word harlot does not simply refer to an immoral woman, does not simply refer to a prostitute. No. To make that application, one has to ignore the preponderant use and the prophetic use of that word. In the Old Testament, the word harlot is applied to a wife who has violated the marriage covenant. That's the way it's used in Hosea. Israel has played the harlot. That's the way it's used in Ezekiel 16, Ezekiel 23. That's the way that it is used consistently throughout the Old Testament. Do you catch the power of that? So the word harlot in its preponderant use, and by the way, as some scholars have noted, even in the few isolated cases in which it does not refer to Israel as the harlot, by the way, as the unfaithful wife of Yahweh who has violated the marriage covenant, in the few places where it does not refer to that, it speaks of those who had been in covenant with Israel and had then played the harlot. This is incredibly powerful. So here's the question that has to be asked. Since Mr. Richardson identifies Islam, the Islamic Caliphate, and Mecca as Babylon, that would seem to demand that he be able to prove that the Islamic Caliphate, that Mecca had at one time been in a marriage relationship with Yahweh. He can't prove that, period. End of story. What's that saying going around these days? Mic drop. The language used in Revelation 17, Revelation chapter 18, speaks of this wife, speaks of this harlot who has violated the covenant. Now, by the way, that's demonstrated in Revelation chapter 16 and verse 19, in which Babylon is remembered by God for her sin. Well, that word remembered, which is the equivalent of the Hebrew word zakar, is a covenantal term. It means that God brought the covenant, his covenant with Babylon, into mind because of her disobedience, and brought the covenant provisions for wrath and punishment on her. Once again, if and since the concept of being a harlot suggests a wife who has become unfaithful to the marriage covenant, and since Babylon would be remembered, covenantally remembered, to such an extent that her sins, her violation of the covenant, would bring God's judgment on her, that positively, absolutely, unequivocally excludes Islam from being Babylon. It just doesn't work. Now look, I discussed this term, for instance, remembered in Revelation 16 in my book, Who is This Babylon? And I talk about its covenantal significance for understanding the identity of Babylon. And although I do not discuss Mr. Richardson's book, what I do discuss has powerful implications and refutes what he is claiming. Let me suggest that you go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. You order the book, Who is This Babylon? Send me a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping, okay? Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. You have a fantastic weekend. Hope to see you on Monday.